Don't you hate it when, like, bam, surprise expense? It's always when you can least afford it, you know? Well, today we are taking a deep dive into 7 simple tips for starting an emergency fund. We're going to figure out how to finally make this whole emergency fund thing happen. Because, picture this. Something unexpected comes up. Maybe your car needs a big repair or something. But instead of stressing, you've got this stash of cash ready to go. Like, no worries. That's the power of having an emergency fund. And this article doesn't just tell you to do it. It really dives into the why. Obviously having money set aside is practical, but it's also like this huge weight off your shoulders. Less anxiety, more freedom, and you just feel more in control of your life. What do you think about that connection between our emotions and how we deal with money?
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's huge. It's almost like when you know you have that safety net, you don't panic and make bad decisions. Like you're less likely to just put something on your credit card because you know that emergency fund money has a job to do. It's really interesting how much psychology plays into spending and saving responsibly.
Totally. And this article gets into the practical stuff too, which I like. They talk about figuring out your magic number, how much you should actually have saved. But they use that phrase, months worth of expenses, which can sound kind of vague.
Yeah, it's hard to know what that actually means.
Exactly. So can you break it down for us? Like, how do we actually figure that out?
Okay, so let's say your essential expenses each month are about $2,000. That's rent, utilities, groceries, all that stuff you have to pay no matter what. If you're aiming for 3 months worth of expenses in your emergency fund, that means you'd want $6,000 saved. That way, if you lose your job or something, you've got at least 3 months to get back on your feet.
That makes so much more sense now.
hmm
But I know the article also says that this magic number can be different for different people.
Totally.
How do you know if you need more or less than that 3 months worth?
Well, it comes down to a few things. How stable is your job? Do you have kids or other people who depend on you? Someone with a really stable job and no kids might be fine with 3 months worth, maybe even less. But if you freelance or your income changes a lot, you probably want to aim for more, maybe 6 months worth or even more. It's all about finding what makes you feel safe and prepared without making you feel overwhelmed by the number.
Totally. You've got to find what works for your life, not just blindly follow some rule.
Yeah.
So let's say you've figured out your magic number. Now you actually have to, like, make it happen.
Yeah, that's the hard part for a lot of people. They want to save, but aren't sure how to get started.
For sure. And this is where this article is great, because they really emphasize opening a separate savings account just for your emergency fund, which makes a ton of sense because I know if I see extra money in my checking account, I'm way more likely to spend it.
Right, and then it's not an emergency fund anymore. It's just your regular money. Having a separate account is like this mental trick, out of sight, out of mind. Plus, then you can easily track your progress, which can be really motivating. Speaking of motivation, did you know that some savings accounts actually help you save faster?
Wait, really? How does that work? I thought all savings accounts were basically the same.
They're not. You want to look for something called a high-yield savings account?
High yield. What's that?
So basically, it just means that you earn a higher interest rate on your money compared to a regular savings account. So your money grows faster over time without you having to do anything extra.
Okay, that's amazing. I'm definitely going to be looking into those. But even with the best savings account in the world, it can still feel kind of overwhelming to think about saving that much money.
Absolutely.
Like, where do you even start?
Well, that's why I love the next tip in this article. Automate your savings.
Okay, yes. I love automating everything. It just makes life so much easier.
It really does. So basically, you just set it up so that a certain amount of money automatically transfers from your checking account to your emergency fund every week or every month, however often you want. You can start with like $25 a week even, and over time, it really adds up.
It's like you're tricking yourself into saving because you don't even have to think about it.
Yeah.
I love that the article gives those examples of starting small, like even $5 or $10 a week.
Exactly. Every little bit helps, right?
For sure. And then there's that whole thing about compound interest working its magic over time.
Right. Even small amounts, if you're consistent, can grow into something really significant.
It's like they say, the best time to start was yesterday, but the second best time is...
Today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, cool, I'm saving. But then what happens when something actually does come up?
Yeah.
A real oh no moment. And you have to actually, like, you easy this money. That almost feels harder. It's like, I worked so hard to save this.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I always try to be super clear about what a real emergency is. The article talks about that too, because it's so easy to dip into savings for something that's like a want and not a need.
Right. They're like, sorry, a vacation is not an emergency.
Yeah.
And as much as I'd like it to be, where do you draw that line then? What are some examples where it's really okay to use that emergency fund?
It's got to be something big, something that could really mess up your finances if you don't pay for it. Like your car breaks down and you need it to get to work, that's an emergency. Huge medical bill that you weren't expecting, definitely an emergency. Even some home repairs, if it's something that'll just get worse and cost more later.
Okay, those are good examples. And I like how the article talks about celebrating your progress. Like, hit $500, treat yourself. It's a long process. Got to stay motivated.
100%. Little wins along the way help a lot.
Totally. But what about when something does happen? Like you have to use a bunch of your savings at once. How do you bounce back from that? That feels discouraging.
It's tough, for sure. I think the key is to not see it as starting over from zero. Like, okay, you had to spend some, but now you know what you're aiming for, and you can just start rebuilding.
Makes sense. So it's more about adjusting, not giving up.
Exactly. Like maybe you even look at your budget and see if there's anywhere you can cut back a little to build it back up faster.
That's a good idea. So we're being proactive, not just reactive.
Yes. And that's actually something else the article mentions about regularly reviewing your savings goals. Things change. Maybe you got a raise. Maybe your expenses went up.
True. Life is rarely like, okay, everything's the same forever.
Right. So it's smart to check in on your budget and savings plan every few months and make sure it still makes sense.
So like a mid-year review for your money. I can get behind that. Okay, but back to actually choosing a savings account. This article talks about high-yield options. But honestly, there are so many choices out there, it's overwhelming.
Oh, tell me about it. And it's not like they make it easy to compare.
Exactly. So besides just looking for the highest interest rate, what else should people look for?
Definitely pay attention to fees. Some banks have monthly maintenance fees, which can really eat into your interest earnings.
Oh, that's annoying. Okay, so fees are important to watch out for.
Yeah. And then think about how easily you want to be able to access your money. You want it accessible, but not too accessible, you know?
Right. Can't just be spending it on a whim. What about those online banks, though? I feel like everyone's talking about those these days.
Those are definitely worth considering. They tend to have higher interest rates and lower fees than traditional banks. Just make sure to do your research, check out their customer service and security, make sure you're comfortable with all that.
Smart. It's kind of crazy how much technology is changing how we deal with money. But it's not all about interest rates and fees and stuff, right? Like, there's a whole mental game to this, too, especially with saving.
Oh, huge EE time. Our thoughts about money can really sabotage us if we're not careful.
It's so easy to get stuck in that negative self-talk, you know? Like, I'm bad with money or I'll never save enough.
The worst. But it's so common, which is why it's important to be aware of it.
So what can we do about it? How do we change that negative money mindset?
You got to catch yourself when you're doing it. Like, hold on, Bran, we're not playing that game today. And then try to reframe it. Instead of, I'm bad with money, maybe it's, I'm learning how to manage my money better.
Ooh, I like that. It's like giving yourself some grace. We're all a work in progress, right?
Exactly. You've got to be kind to yourself, especially when it comes to something as stressful as money. It really is amazing how much our mindset affects, well, everything, really.
Totally. And this article's FAQ section had this point about emergency funds that I thought was interesting. It's not just about having money for those surprise expenses. It's also about avoiding debt.
Oh, that's huge. So many people don't think about that until they're already in debt.
It's true. Like if something happens and you don't have that emergency fund, what do?
Exactly. You put it on a credit card, take out a loan, maybe even borrow from family, and then suddenly you're dealing with interest rates and payment plans, and it just adds so much stress.
Not to mention, it can strain those relationships if you're borrowing from people you're close to.
Absolutely. That's why having that emergency fund is like, it gives you options, you know?
It's like you're in the driver's seat, not just reacting to whatever life throws at you.
100%.
And, something we haven't touched on much is that idea of community. Like, we don't have to figure all this out on our own, right?
No way. I always tell people talking about money can feel really isolating, but it doesn't have to be.
For sure. So how do we find those people, those communities that can relate and offer support?
Oh, there are tons of ways. It kind of depends on what you're into, you know? There are online forums and social media groups dedicated to personal finance. Tons of podcasts, too.
Podcasts are great for that. Just listening while you're doing other stuff.
Exactly. But if you're more of an in-person kind of person, look for local workshops, maybe even financial literacy classes at a community college or something.
That's a great idea.
The important thing is to just find your people, the ones who get it, you know?
It's like we're all in this together, learning and supporting each other along the way.
Exactly.
And that kind of ties into the whole idea of educating yourself about money, right? Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to something as important as our finances.
100%. And the good news is there are so many resources available these days.
Oh, yeah. Books, podcasts, websites, even apps.